500 to 1150. With the end of the great classical empires of Greece and Rome, much of the world was thrown into disarray. Beset by invaders on several frontiers, Europe entered a period of turmoil and cultural stagnation, known as the Dark Ages. Farther east, Persia, China, and India dissolved into struggling kingdoms. In this political power vacuum, the unifying force became faith. Christianity in the West, Islam in the Near East, and Buddhism and Hinduism in the Far East. Christianity helped to hold the Byzantine Empire firm while others failed. It supported Charlemagne's rise to power, kept learning alive in monasteries, and even reached into Russia to convert the rulers of Kiev. In Arabia, Islam was born and grew rapidly to dominate lands from Spain to India. Buddhism reached China over the Silk Road, winning popular support even as China's rulers put Confucian principles to work in their vast bureaucracies. Hinduism traveled from India into Southeast Asia and took physical form in the great temples of Angkor. Outside Europe, the Dark Ages were not so gloomy. Byzantine scholars kept Greek learning alive. Islamic ones developed algebra and compiled the 1001 Nights. In China, the Tang dynasty gave birth to block printing, delicate porcelain, and poetry. As the millennium ended, the world was turning a corner, leaving the Dark Ages behind and looking forward to an era of vitality and progress. The Maya. 500 CE to 1000. Maya civilization, which reached its peak about CE 600, was more than 1,000 years in the making. During that long ascent, the Maya were influenced by the neighboring Olmec and by the city-state of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. The Maya achieved something unique as a culture. They were the first Americans to bequeath to posterity not only pyramids and palaces, but also a coherent written record. Others in the area had used writing sparingly to record names, dates, or other details. The Maya chronicled the rise and fall of their rulers, the first historical figures to emerge in any detail from the cryptic annals of ancient America. The Maya inscribed hieroglyphs on pots, stone monuments, and bark paper or deerskin. Only recently did linguists succeed in deciphering their writings, which were thought to be related to astronomical observations or the Mayan calendar. The jottings of these presumably peaceful stargazers proved to be quite different. The proud declarations of warlike rulers who offered up their own blood and that of their enemies to the gods. Chief among the Maya deities was the maize god, who, according to legend, died in a contest with demonic lords of the underworld and was reborn in the form of a cornstalk, the staple of the Maya. The ritual ball game they played symbolized that mythic contest and had a similar outcome. The losers were sacrificed in the belief that their blood would nourish the earth and help renew the blessings of the maize god and other deities. This fateful contest was played in stone courtyards with a solid rubber sphere about the size of a human head. In legend, the lords of the underworld used a skull as their ball. A rubber ball that size could injure contestants, and they wore protective gear around the midriff, arms, and knees. Depictions show two players on each side striking the ball with their hips or shoulders rather than with their feet or hands. In some courts, hoops projected from walls on either side of the playing surface, and the object might have been to propel the ball through the opposing side's loop. The ball game was just one of many forms of blood sacrifice the Maya engaged in for religious purposes. Royalty sometimes drew their own blood in sufficient quantities to grow delirious and experience visions. They also took part in ritualized combat with rival groups aimed at collecting prisoners for sacrifice. The most prized captors were opposing royalty, whose blood was considered especially appealing to the gods. The Maya waged war not only to quarrel sacrificial victims, but also to expand their territory. Like the ancient Greeks, they shared a common language and culture, but were divided into competing city-states. Rivals sometimes resolved their differences through marriage alliances, but tensions often persisted until one side conquered the other. Vanquished rulers were not always executed, but they had to recognize the victor as their overlord. One of the leading Maya city-states was Tikal, which arose in the jungle of Petén, near the ruins of earlier Maya ceremonial centers. By CE 800, through conquest and alliances, the city of Tikal covered an area of some 50 miles square with more than 50,000 inhabitants. One measure of Tikal's strength and stability was that a single dynasty held sway there for more than 600 years. When a king died without a male heir, the succession passed through his daughter to her husband or consort. That happened early in the 6th century when a child queen known as the Lady of Tikal wed a prominent general who served with her as co-ruler. Bringing a general into the royal family made sense in a society where city-states faced constant threats from rivals or rebellious subjects, who looked to the movements of stars to determine when to stage their attacks. One such star war brought calamity to Tikal in CE 562. It suffered a defeat so devastating that it did not fully recover for more than a century. The perpetrator of that attack might have been the ruler of Calakmul, a rising power that menaced other city-states around this time. In CE 599, troops from Calakmul ventured to Palenque, some 150 miles away at the western fringe of the Maya realm, and inflicted a stinging defeat on Palenque's queen, Lady Yal Ikna, one of few women to rule a Maya city-state on her own. The attackers toppled images of the city's patron deities, and the humiliation cast a long shadow over the queen's successors. Palenque's prestige was restored, however, by a remarkable king named Pakal, or Sunshield, who came to power in CE 615 at the age of 12 and ruled for 68 years. He reached out to the forlorn rulers of Tikal and offered them protection against menacing Calakmul, and he enhanced the grandeur of Palenque by building a lavish palace, pyramid, and temple. Deep within the pyramid lay Pakal's tomb chamber, where his body was laid to rest in 683, painted bright red and adorned in jade. Pakal's majestic send-off was every Maya ruler's dream. The worst nightmare was the fate that befell the king of the city-state of Copan in 738, when he was captured by a rebellious underling and beheaded. Copan soon revived under a shrewd king named Smokeshell, who married a princess from Palenque, which was far enough away to pose little threat. A great builder like Pakal, Smokeshell and his successors constructed a soaring complex of pyramids and temples known as the Copan Acropolis, one of the last great Mayan feats. The Maya were keen astronomers who charted the movements of the sun, moon, and stars for reasons both practical and spiritual. Keeping track of equinoxes and other astronomical events was useful for determining when to plant crops. But the overriding purpose of the activity was to allow the Maya to synchronize their rituals and activities with the movements of heavenly bodies that they revered and believed could determine their fate. Venus, for example, was thought to govern warfare, and rulers planned battles according to its movements. Maya scribes devised a hieroglyph to represent each such wars, a star showering the earth with droplets representing water or blood. It was used to denote great conquests that toppled rulers and subjugated their people. Maya monuments were sometimes aligned so as to highlight important astronomical events. At Tikal, Venus and Jupiter aligned directly over the tip of the pyramid. At Chichen Itza, a temple was aligned so that at the spring and fall equinox, a serpent-like shadow seemed to slither towards the head of a snake chiseled in stone. Recording the movements of heavenly bodies enabled the Maya to construct an elaborate calendar consisting of 2 cycles, a solar year of 365 days and a ceremonial year of 260 days, each of which was devoted to its own deity. Once every 52 years, these cycles aligned so that the first day of the solar year coincided with the first day of the ceremonial year. This was an event of great ceremony and significance for the Maya. To keep track of longer spans of time, the Maya devised their so-called long count, starting with the creation of the universe, a date corresponding to 3114 BCE. Much to the dismay of Doomsday 2012 proponents, the world survived the full cycle of the long count, which ended on December 21st, 2012. The soil of the Maya was not very fertile, and by the 9th century it could no longer support population densities as high as 500 people per square mile in some places. Rulers and their troops had to range ever farther afield to collect enough food to support the teeming urban centers, and the demands they made on outlying areas kindled resentments that grew into fiery rebellions. The collapse of the Maya civilization around CE 900 did not bring an end to the Maya, whose descendants inhabit the region to this day. You can find them in Guatemala and Mexico. But most Maya cities were destroyed or abandoned, with the notable exception of Chichen Itza, which may have endured in part because it came under the influence of the Toltec, the predecessors of the Aztec in the Valley of Mexico. Once the center of power in Mesoamerica, that fertile valley to the north regained its prominence as the exhausted fields of the Yucatan reverted to jungle and the lost cities of the Maya crumbled. Anglo-Saxon England, 500 to 1066. After Roman forces withdrew from Britain in the 4th and 5th centuries, the island became a battleground of competing invaders from Germany, France, and Scandinavia. Pushed by Huns from the east, Germanic tribes of Angles and Saxons moved in. By CE 600, they had established dominance over the Britons. Many of the Romanized Celts were pushed into Wales and Ireland. Others were probably absorbed into the society of the victors. The West Saxon Code of 694 provides for Welshmen as substantial landowners and those who performed errands for the Saxon king. Various invading groups carved their own territories in Britain. At one time, there were 7 kingdoms, 3 ruled by Saxons, 3 ruled by Angles, and 1 by Jutes. Vying for supremacy over all Britain, they fought each other frequently. A revival of sorts came in the 7th century when much of England converted to Christianity. Led by Augustine in 597, Christian missionaries began to convert the British and establish centers of learning in Canterbury, Malmesbury, and Northumbria. Scholars from Ireland and the continent brought in books, assembled libraries, and began to write histories of the island. Not all literature of the period was Christian, however. The great poem Beowulf, based on Germanic legend, is thought to date from the 7th or 8th centuries. Under the reign of 2 kings of Mercia, Athelbald and Offa, England knew a period of stability. Monastic learning flourished in this time, and Offa became so well known that Francis Charlemagne tried to arrange a marriage between his son and Offa's daughter, which Offa refused. Offa also managed to build a dike to protect his border with Wales. He could not, however, protect the kingdom against its next great threat, the Vikings. Seafarers from Scandinavia, mostly Denmark, had been raiding Britain's shores for years, but by the early 9th century they were a serious menace. English King Alfred the Great was able to contain them through the late 9th century, holding on to Wessex, when much of the rest of England had fallen. Although warlike, most of the invaders were farmers who sought fertile valleys on which to grow crops and graze their animals. By the late 9th century, the fierce Saxons had prevailed, absorbing the Angles and the Jutes, and restricting the Vikings to an area called the Danelaw in northeastern England. Even that was eventually won from the Vikings, and after 954, England was one kingdom. Even so, it was a compromise, with Danish and Saxon kings alternating into the new millennium. One more major battle would determine a new set of rules. In the 11th century, Edward the Confessor was the Saxon king of England. Related through his mother to the Normans across the Channel, he was pro-Norman. When a powerful Saxon earl named Godwin revolted unsuccessfully, Edward banished him and named William of Normandy as his heir to the throne. Godwin's son Harold returned to England and rose in power, but according to chroniclers, acknowledged William's eventual right to the kingship. When Edward died in 1066, however, Harold quickly had himself crowned king of England. Now there were 3 laying claim to the throne: William, Duke of Normandy, the original heir; Harold, the Saxon son of Godwin, already crowned; and King Harold of Norway, who took the opportunity of Edward's death to invade northern England. Harold sped to the north and defeated the Norwegian, then raced south again to meet William, who had invaded across the Channel. Wearied by battle and travel, the Anglo-Saxon or English forces of Harold fell to the Normans at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. On Christmas Day, William became King William I of England, also known as William the Conqueror. Saxon nobility was shattered. Norman barons were awarded large estates, and French was spoken in the court. But the Anglo-Saxon population dominated, and eventually so did the English language, which became a rich amalgam of Anglo-Saxon and French. A brief history here and survey from 550 BCE to CE 700. The great empires of the classical period, those of Greece, Rome, China, India, and Persia, had widespread influence over cultures from northern Europe to the Far East. Only in the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Pacific Islands did events proceed untouched by these dominant civilizations. We have sub-Saharan Africa. Spreading southward from the area that is modern-day Nigeria, the Bantu people gradually had been intermarrying and absorbing other cultures in Africa throughout the first millennium BCE. Around 500 BCE, these agricultural people began to produce iron and charcoal pit furnaces. The new technology gave them not only better weapons, arrowheads, knives, and spears, but also tougher agricultural tools, such as hoe blades. Able to clear large areas of forest for planting, the Bantu population grew rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa. not only spreading ironworking, herding, and agriculture into the hands of hunter-gatherers, but also disseminating Bantu languages across sub-Saharan Africa. Polynesia. Sailing across vast expanses of the Pacific in their outrigger canoes, Polynesian settlers gradually ventured farther and farther east in the first millennium BCE, settling islands such as Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tahiti. From Tahiti, they launched even longer voyages, reaching the Hawaiian Islands in about 100 BCE and Easter Island by about CE 500. On these islands, they established economies based on fishing and agriculture, carrying dogs, pigs, and chickens with them from place to place, and introducing such food staples as yams, breadfruits, and bananas to the tropical lands they colonized. Islands were governed by hereditary chiefs who ruled with the aid of priests, administrators, and soldiers. Conflicts frequently arose between chiefs as populations outpaced resources, sometimes leading to yet another migration and another distant island settled. Egypt. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his successors carved his empire into three great realms. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, and his descendants in the Ptolemaic dynasty went on to rule the ancient land for almost 300 years. The Greek overlords ruled from Alexandria, greatest of Alexandria's namesake cities. Built at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria became a city of great wealth and culture. Its harbor, where a great lighthouse of the Pharos of Alexandria used a system of bronze mirrors to reflect light out to sea, was said to hold 1,200 ships at one time. Most famous of all of Alexandria's cultural achievements was the Alexandrian Library, which held most of the writings of classical times in more than 500,000 books. The library was to burn later, and most of that knowledge was lost. Ptolemaic Egypt was a sophisticated cosmopolitan culture in which Egyptians, Greeks, Macedonians, Babylonians, Jews, Arabs, and others lived side by side. The last of its Ptolemaic rulers, Cleopatra, formed romantic alliances with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but finally killed herself in 30 BCE when faced with certain defeat. The following year, Egypt fell into Roman hands. Japan. Little is known about Japan's earliest cultures. Nomads from Northeast Asia settled the islands, and their descendants eventually formed themselves into a few dozen states ruled by aristocratic clans. By the 3rd century BCE, the Yayoi culture, marked by the use of wheel-turned pottery and cultivated rice, began to spread across Japan. At the same time, Chinese culture began to infiltrate the islands via Korea, and the Japanese adopted the use of iron, bronze, and textiles. Chinese culture came increasingly to dominate Japan. Weaving, irrigation, and the Chinese ideographic script came to Japan from China, along with the writings of the philosopher Confucius. By the 4th century CE, the militaristic Yamato clan had come to power in Japan. Yamato armies brought various powerful clans under their control, established control over most of the archipelago, and even ventured into the Korean peninsula. Most famous of the Yamato rulers was the semi-legendary Ojin Tenno, who ruled sometime in the 3rd and 4th century CE and was later deified as the god of war. According to some stories, it was Ojin who consolidated Yamato power, who also instituted land reform and cultural exchange with the mainland. Whatever the truth of Ojin's life, he had a marvelous tomb that is still visible today. Almost 1,400 feet long, it was filled with the swords, armor, and arrowheads suitable for a god of war. Britain. By the end of the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was no longer able to hold onto its far-flung territory. Besieged at home and abroad by invading tribes, Rome gradually withdrew its troops and its support from Britain. In the wake of Rome's departure, British leader Vortigern took over in England, and around CE 430 formed an alliance with the Saxons, who had been encroaching from the North Sea. Once the Saxons had settled on Britain's east shore, they were disinclined to follow Vortigern's orders. In CE 442, they called in their allies to wrest the island from the Britons. For years, the British and Saxons struggled for control, but the tide finally turned in favor of the British in the late part of the century, when Ambrosius Aurelianus and his war leader Arthur used their cavalry to drive out the Saxons and bring a short period of peace to England among the British Isles.